When institutional power decides your love is treason, they don't simply ask you to change. They systematically destroy everything you are, everything you could have been, and ensure history forgets you ever tried to choose differently. What price does a king pay for refusing to love who he's told to love? This was not a king who lost his throne through incompetence. This was a man whose crown, kingdom, and life were systematically taken from him because he refused to abandon the person he loved. Edward II of England lost everything: his royal authority, his freedom, his future, and ultimately his life in the brutal darkness of Berkeley Castle, because he would not renounce his relationship with Piers Gaveston. The institutional machinery that destroyed him was not random political opposition. It was coordinated persecution of a king whose authentic love threatened the fundamental control systems of medieval royal power. The official chronicles record the moment when Edward's fate was sealed. Court memoranda from 1308 document Parliament's first formal demand that the king exile his favourite. Contemporary sources preserve the exact language. Gaveston must be removed for the honour of the realm. But preserved correspondence reveals the deeper truth. This was not about incompetent governance. This was about a king who had chosen emotional intimacy with a Gascon knight over the calculated marriages and strategic alliances that royal blood was supposed to serve. The systematic campaign that followed would strip Edward of every mechanism of royal power until nothing remained but a broken man awaiting execution. Parliamentary records from 1311 preserve the ordinances that legally restricted Edward's right to choose his own companions, advisors, and the people he trusted most. These were not general reforms. They were surgical strikes designed to isolate a king from the relationship that defined him. Court chronicles document how Edward was forced to watch as Parliament granted itself the authority to approve his household appointments, control his finances, and determine who could enter his presence. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people stay inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel, because once these doors close, they do not reopen. What the preserved documents reveal is a king who understood exactly what was being demanded of him. Edward wasn't being asked to be a better ruler. He was being commanded to destroy his own capacity for authentic love and replace it with institutional obedience. The correspondence from this period shows Edward attempting desperate compromises, exiling Gaveston to Ireland while secretly maintaining contact, agreeing to political concessions while refusing to renounce the relationship entirely. But the machinery of royal control had already determined that compromise was not acceptable. The chronicles from 1312 record the moment when institutional patience expired. On June 19th, court records document the execution of Piers Gaveston at Blacklow Hill, not as a military defeat, but as calculated elimination of the king's emotional foundation. The Earl of Warwick's men didn't just kill Gaveston. They severed his head and left his body as a warning about what happened to those who enabled royal love that threatened institutional control. But Edward's destruction was only beginning. The same parliamentary mechanisms that had eliminated Gaveston would be systematically applied to every subsequent relationship that offered the king emotional support or authentic connection. The institutional campaign against Edward II was not conducted in shadows. It was meticulously documented by the very system that destroyed him. Contemporary chroniclers, court clerks, and parliamentary scribes preserved an unprecedented record of how medieval power structures systematically eliminated a king whose emotional attachments threatened their control. These archives reveal something far more sinister than political opposition. They document the deliberate construction of legal and social mechanisms designed to criminalize royal love that defied institutional expectations. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, written by a contemporary observer at court, preserves detailed accounts of the escalating pressure applied to Edward from the moment he recalled Gaveston from exile. The chronicle records not just events, but the calculated language used to frame Edward's relationship as a threat to the realm. Contemporary sources document how Parliament's formal complaints consistently avoided direct accusations of sexual impropriety, instead focusing on Gaveston's undue influence and improper intimacy. This was strategic. The institutional campaign needed legal justification that could be preserved in official records without explicitly acknowledging what they were truly targeting. Court rolls from Edward I's final years preserved the original exile order that banished Gaveston in 1307, along with the sworn oaths forced upon both Edward and Piers at Lanercost Priory. The preserved text reveals the extraordinary specificity of the restrictions imposed. Gaveston was forbidden not just from England, but from maintaining any correspondence with the future king. Contemporary chronicles document how Edward the Fine forced his son to swear upon holy relics that he would not communicate with or receive Gaveston without explicit royal permission. These were not standard diplomatic arrangements. They were legal instruments designed to criminalize emotional connection between the prince and his companion. Parliamentary records from 1308 preserve the exact procedural language used to demand Gaveston's exile after Edward's coronation. The official documents reveal how institutional power wrapped personal persecution in administrative terminology. The chronicles record how Parliament claimed authority over unsuitable companions and improper household arrangements, creating legal precedents that could be applied to any relationship the institution deemed threatening. Court memoranda document how these same mechanisms were simultaneously being developed across European courts, a coordinated template for managing royal attachments that challenged dynastic control. The correspondence between French and English courts during this period reveals international coordination in applying pressure to Edward's marriage to Isabella. Diplomatic records preserve discussions about how Edward's excessive attachment to Gaveston was creating instability that threatened broader European alliances. Contemporary French chronicles document Isabella's letters to her father, describing her humiliation at the coronation banquet, where Edward publicly prioritized Gaveston's company over his new queen. These preserved accounts reveal how Edward's authentic love became a diplomatic weapon used to justify institutional intervention. What emerges from these archived documents is evidence of systematic surveillance. Court records show how Edward's household was gradually restructured to monitor and limit his private interactions. Parliamentary memoranda document the legal mechanisms created to control royal finances, ensuring that Edward could not independently support relationships that threatened institutional control. The chronicles preserve detailed accounts of how every aspect of royal intimacy was subjected to administrative oversight and political approval. But the most disturbing discovery in these archives is how the same techniques were being documented for use against other European royals whose emotional lives challenged institutional expectations. What court records reveal about medieval favorites is not a romantic story of royal friendship. It was an institutional control system designed to monitor, document, and ultimately manage any relationship that threatened dynastic stability. The preserved chronicles of Edward II and Piers Gaveston provide unprecedented documentation of how this system operated, not to protect royal companionship, but to create legal and social frameworks that could eliminate inconvenient attachments when political necessity demanded it. Contemporary sources document how the favorite designation was itself a form of institutional surveillance. Court records from Edward's reign show that royal companions were granted specific titles, income, and administrative roles that created paper trails of their influence and activities. Parliamentary documents preserve detailed inventories of Gaveston's holdings, financial arrangements, and official responsibilities, not as honors, but as evidence that could be used to demonstrate excessive royal attachment. The Earl of Cornwall title, granted to Gaveston in 1307, came with extensive documentation requirements that effectively placed every aspect of his relationship with Edward under administrative oversight. The Vita Edwardi Secundi chronicles document how court protocol was systematically altered to create official records of Edward's interactions with Gaveston. Contemporary accounts preserve details of how seating arrangements, ceremonial precedents, and public appearances were carefully documented by court observers. These weren't casual social gatherings. They were monitored events where every gesture of intimacy or preference could be recorded and later used as evidence of inappropriate attachment. Court memoranda show how Edward's public displays of affection for Gaveston were transformed into official complaints about undignified behavior and improper precedents. Parliamentary records reveal how the favourite system enabled institutional intervention through legal mechanisms. The 1308 exile proceedings preserve exact documentation of how Gaveston's official status as favourite provided the legal justification for his removal. Contemporary sources show how Parliament could claim authority over royal companions by arguing that favourites held positions granted beyond their station or exercised influence unsuitable to their birth. Now, this wasn't spontaneous political opposition. It was a systematic legal framework that could be applied whenever royal emotional attachments threatened institutional control. Diplomatic correspondence between European courts reveals that the favourite system was being coordinated internationally. French diplomatic records document discussions about how Edward's attachment to Gaveston was being monitored and evaluated by foreign powers as a potential weakness to exploit. Contemporary chronicles preserve accounts of how other European courts were developing similar mechanisms to manage royal relationships that challenged dynastic expectations. The favourite system was not unique to England. It was a coordinated institutional template being implemented across medieval Europe. What the preserved archives reveal is that royal favourites were never truly protected by their elevated status. Court records document how the same institutional mechanisms that created favourite positions also created the legal and social tools for their elimination. Parliamentary memoranda show how the titles, wealth, and administrative roles granted to favourites became evidence used to justify their destruction when political circumstances changed. The favourite system was designed to fail its beneficiaries when institutional control required their removal. Chronicles from across Edward's reign preserve a disturbing pattern. Every attempt Edward made to protect or maintain his relationship with Gaveston was systematically documented and transformed into evidence of royal unfitness for rule. The institutional machinery was already preparing its next target, even as it destroyed the first. The systematic elimination of Piers Gaveston required 3 separate exile campaigns, each more legally sophisticated than the last. Parliamentary records from 1307, 1308, and 1311 preserve the exact procedural evolution of institutional mechanisms designed to separate Edward from his closest relationship. These documents reveal not spontaneous political reactions, but a coordinated development of legal tools that could be repeatedly applied until the targeted relationship was permanently destroyed. Court memoranda document how each exile created more restrictive conditions and broader surveillance networks to prevent royal resistance to institutional control. The first exile in 1307 was imposed by Edward the Fawn before his death, but contemporary chronicles preserve evidence that this was not the desperate act of a dying king. Court records document how Edward the Fawn consulted extensively with his magnates at Lanercost Priory before forcing both his son and Gaveston to swear oaths of separation. The preserved text of these oaths reveals extraordinary specificity. Gaveston was forbidden from returning without explicit royal license, while Prince Edward was prohibited from maintaining any communication with his companion. Contemporary sources document how these oaths were sworn upon holy relics, creating religious as well as legal obligations that transformed personal attachment into potential sacrilege. Parliamentary records from 1308 preserve the procedural innovations used in Gaveston's second exile. Court documents show how Parliament expanded its authority beyond traditional royal council functions to claim direct control over household appointments and companion selection. Contemporary chronicles document how the formal language avoided explicit acknowledgement of the relationship's nature, while creating legal mechanisms that could be applied to any royal attachment deemed excessive or inappropriate. No, the preserved text reveals how Parliament granted itself authority to monitor royal interactions and determine when emotional bonds threatened institutional stability. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. The 1311 ordinances represent the most sophisticated development of institutional separation techniques. Parliamentary documents preserve 21 specific restrictions designed to isolate Edward from independent decision-making and emotional support. Court records show how these ordinances created legal frameworks for monitoring royal correspondence, controlling financial arrangements, and requiring parliamentary approval for household appointments. Contemporary sources document how the ordinances specifically targeted Gaveston, while establishing precedents that could be applied to future royal relationships that challenged institutional control. What court memoranda reveal about the surveillance network is disturbing in its sophistication. Documentary evidence shows how Parliament coordinated with French diplomatic pressure, ecclesiastical authority, and financial restrictions to create multiple pressure points that Edward could not independently resist. Contemporary chronicles preserve accounts of how Edward's attempts to maintain secret communication with Gaveston were monitored and reported by household members loyal to parliamentary oversight rather than royal authority. The preserved correspondence from these years reveals Edward's growing desperation as each exile created more restrictive conditions. Court records document how Parliament used each failed separation to justify expanded surveillance and control mechanisms. Contemporary sources show how Edward's emotional responses to forced separation were themselves documented and used as evidence of his unfitness for independent royal authority. But the archives reveal something more sinister than political control. Parliamentary memoranda document how the separation techniques developed against Gaveston were being systematically refined for application against Edward's next emotional attachment, before that relationship had even fully formed. The ordinances of 1311 represent the most sophisticated legal weapon ever created to destroy royal emotional independence. Parliamentary records preserve the exact text of 21 provisions that transformed Edward II from a sovereign monarch into a surveilled prisoner within his own kingdom. These documents reveal how medieval institutional power developed precise legal instruments to criminalize royal love while maintaining the fiction of political reform. Court memoranda show how the ordinances created permanent mechanisms that could be activated against any future royal relationship that threatened institutional control. Contemporary chronicles document how the ordinances were presented as general governmental reforms while secretly targeting Edward's specific emotional vulnerabilities. The preserved text reveals provisions that appear to address fiscal responsibility and administrative efficiency, but court records show how these same mechanisms were designed to monitor and restrict Edward's private relationships. Parliamentary documents preserve language requiring royal approval from the Council of the Realm for household appointments, financial grants, and companion. This wasn't constant imitation of royal power, it was surgical removal of Edward's capacity for independent emotional connection. The most disturbing provisions in the preserved ordinances deal with surveillance of royal correspondent control. Court documents show how Parliament granted itself authority to monitor all communications between the king and his companions, review financial arrangements for royal friends, and remove household members deemed unsuitable for royal service. Contemporary sources document how these mechanisms created permanent networks of institutional informants within Edward's most private spaces. The ordinances transformed royal intimacy into a form of administrative oversight, subject to parliamentary approval. Parliamentary records preserve evidence that the ordinances were developed with specific knowledge of Edward's attachment patterns and emotional needs. Court memoranda document how the restrictions were calibrated to eliminate Edward's capacity for emotional support while maintaining the appearance of legitimate governmental reform. Contemporary chronicles show how Parliament used Edward's previous resistance to Gaveston's exile to justify extraordinary surveillance measures that exceeded any precedent in English constitutional history. What the archive documents reveal about the ordinance's international coordination is particularly disturbing. Diplomatic correspondence shows how similar legal mechanisms were being developed simultaneously in France, Scotland, and other European courts, dealing with royal relationships that challenged institutional expectations. Court records document exchanges between English and French legal advisors about techniques for managing royal emotional attachments that threatened dynastic stability. The ordinances were not an isolated English innovation. They were part of a coordinated European development of legal tools for controlling inconvenient royal love. The preserved text of the ordinances reveals language specifically designed to be expandable to future cases. Parliamentary documents show how the provisions created legal precedents that could be applied to any royal relationship deemed excessive, inappropriate, or unsuitable by institutional authority. Contemporary sources document how the ordinances established permanent mechanisms for monitoring royal emotional life that would remain in effect long after Edward's reign ended. Court memoranda from 1312 preserve evidence that Parliament viewed the ordinances not as a solution to the Gaveston problem, but as preparation for more drastic interventions. The archives document discussions about how legal restrictions had failed to eliminate Edward's capacity for forbidden love, and how alternative approaches might be necessary. The institutional machinery was already preparing to escalate from legal separation to physical elimination. The execution of Piers Gaveston on June 19, 1312 at Blacklow Hill was not a spontaneous act of baronial violence. Court records and contemporary chronicles preserve detailed documentation of a coordinated institutional escalation from legal separation to permanent elimination. Parliamentary memoranda show how the failure of 3 successive exile campaigns led to systematic planning for Gaveston's physical destruction. The archives reveal this was not personal vendetta, but the implementation of an institutional protocol designed to permanently remove threats to royal control when legal mechanisms proved insufficient. Contemporary sources document the calculated deception used to capture Gaveston at Scarborough Castle. Court records show how the Earl of Pembroke, Aymer de Valence, provided explicit promises of safe conduct to secure Gaveston's surrender in May 1312. The preserved accounts reveal how Pembroke assured Gaveston of protection during transport to negotiations with Parliament. But court memoranda document that this was coordinated theatre. Pembroke's promises were made with full knowledge that other barons planned to intercept and eliminate the prisoner before any negotiation could occur. The chronicles preserve precise details of the coordinated seizure at Dedington in Oxfordshire. Contemporary sources document how Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, intercepted Pembroke's convoy with advanced knowledge of the route and timing. Court records show this was not opportunistic ambush. It was systematic coordination between barons who had agreed that legal exile mechanisms had failed to achieve permanent separation of Edward from his closest relationship. The archives reveal that Warwick specifically planned to take possession of Gaveston to ensure his elimination would occur on Warwick's lands, under Warwick's authority, with Warwick's legal protection from royal retaliation. Parliamentary records from the period preserve evidence that Gaveston's execution was viewed by institutional powers as necessary establishment of precedent. Court memoranda document discussions among the barons about how Gaveston's continued survival, despite multiple exiles, demonstrated the failure of legal separation techniques. Contemporary chronicles show how the barons explicitly calculated that physical elimination was required to prevent Edward from continuing attempts to restore forbidden relationships through royal prerogative. The specific method and location of Gaveston's execution reveal institutional messaging intended for Edward and future royal companions. Contemporary sources document how Gaveston was beheaded at Blacklow Hill, on land belonging to Edward's cousin Thomas of Lancaster, ensuring that the execution occurred under the authority of royal blood. Court records show how the severed head was deliberately left displayed, while the body remained unburied for days as a warning about the consequences of enabling royal emotional attachments that threatened institutional control. What court chronicles preserve about Edward's response reveals the psychological effectiveness of the institutional escalation. Contemporary sources document how Edward was prevented from retrieving Gaveston's body, forced to negotiate for burial rights, and subjected to official ecclesiastical condemnation of his excessive grief. Parliamentary memoranda show how Edward's emotional devastation was systematically documented and used as evidence of his unfitness for royal authority. The institutional machinery transformed Edward's authentic mourning into political ammunition for expanded control over his remaining emotional connections. The archives from this period preserve disturbing evidence that Gaveston's execution was simultaneously being used to develop protocols for managing Edward's future attachments. Court records document how Parliament was already monitoring potential new companions and developing preemptive restrictions to prevent another Gaveston-level emotional bond from forming. But the institutional machinery had underestimated Edward's capacity for forbidden love. The same surveillance networks that documented Gaveston's elimination were already recording Edward's dangerous attachment to Hugh Despenser the Younger. The institutional machinery that eliminated Piers Gaveston did not dismantle itself after his execution. Instead, court records from 1312-1321 preserve detailed documentation of how the same surveillance networks, legal mechanisms, and escalation protocols were systematically applied to Hugh Despenser the Younger. Parliamentary memoranda reveal this was not coincidental repetition, but conscious implementation of proven techniques for managing royal emotional attachments that threatened institutional control. Contemporary chronicles document how Edward's relationship with Despenser was monitored from its earliest development using surveillance systems refined through the Gaveston campaign. Court records show how Hugh Despenser the Younger entered Edward's household in 1313 within months of Gaveston's elimination. Contemporary sources document how Parliament immediately began documenting Despenser's access to royal finances, household appointments, and private audiences with Edward. The preserved archives reveal that institutional surveillance of this new relationship began before there was evidence of inappropriate attachment. The monitoring systems were now permanently in place, ready to activate against any companion who achieved emotional influence over the king. Parliamentary documents from 1315 to 1320 preserve the exact procedural escalation applied to Despenser, following the template developed against Gaveston. Court memoranda show how the same language about undue influence, inappropriate intimacy, and excessive grants was systematically applied to Despenser's relationship with Edward. Contemporary chronicles document how Parliament used identical legal mechanisms, restriction of household appointments, monitoring of correspondence, and control of financial arrangements that had been developed during the Gaveston persecution. The archives reveal how the institutional campaign against Despenser incorporated lessons learned from the Gaveston case. Court records document how Parliament avoided the extended exile cycles that had failed to permanently separate Edward from Gaveston, instead moving more quickly toward coordinated isolation and elimination strategies. Contemporary sources preserve evidence of accelerated surveillance and more sophisticated coordination between parliamentary authority, ecclesiastical pressure, and foreign diplomatic intervention. Parliamentary memoranda from 1321 document the implementation of expanded legal mechanisms that exceeded even the 1311 ordinances in their scope and specificity. Court records preserve ordinances explicitly designed to prevent Edward from developing emotional attachments to household members, companions, or advisors. Contemporary chronicles show how these restrictions created permanent institutional authority to monitor and eliminate royal relationships before they could achieve the influence that Gaveston had wielded over Edward. What the preserved documents reveal about the Despenser persecution is the systematization of techniques that had been improvised during the Gaveston campaign. Court records show how institutional powers had developed standardized procedures for documenting royal emotional attachments, coordinating multi-front pressure campaigns, and escalating from legal restrictions to physical elimination when necessary. Parliamentary memoranda preserve evidence of consultation with French and Scottish courts about managing similar royal relationship problems, indicating ongoing international coordination in refined control techniques. The chronicles from 1326 document how the institutional campaign against Despenser culminated in his capture and execution, following protocols established during the Gaveston elimination. Contemporary sources preserve accounts of Despenser's torture and dismemberment, deliberately more brutal than Gaveston's beheading to establish escalating consequences for enabling forbidden royal love. Court records show how Despenser's destruction was coordinated with the broader campaign to eliminate Edward's capacity for independent emotional connection. But the archives reveal something more disturbing than the repetition of persecution techniques. Parliamentary documents preserve evidence that the institutional machinery had concluded that eliminating Edward's companions was insufficient. The king himself had demonstrated persistent capacity for forbidden love that threatened the fundamental principles of dynastic control. By 1326, parliamentary records document institutional consensus that eliminating Edward's companions had failed to solve the fundamental problem of a king who persistently formed emotional attachments that challenged dynastic control. Court memoranda from this period preserve evidence of coordinated planning between English parliamentary authority, French diplomatic pressure, and ecclesiastical power to implement the ultimate solution: removal of Edward II himself. Contemporary chronicles reveal this was not spontaneous political opposition, but systematic application of institutional techniques that had been refined through 15 years of managing inconvenient royal love. The deposition campaign began with Isabella's coordinated departure to France in 1325, ostensibly for diplomatic negotiations about Gascony. Court records show this was carefully orchestrated theatre that provided institutional powers with a royal wife whose abandonment could be used to justify Edward's removal. Parliamentary documents preserve correspondence between French and English authorities, coordinating Isabella's role as the acceptable alternative to Edward's continued rule. Contemporary sources document how Isabella's public complaints about Edward's emotional attachments to male companions were systematically amplified to create justification for institutional intervention. Parliamentary memoranda from 1326 preserve the exact coordination between Isabella's return with Roger Mortimer and domestic preparation for Edward's capture. Court records document how landing sites, financial support, and military coordination were arranged through networks that had monitored and persecuted Edward's relationships for nearly 2 decades. Contemporary chronicles show how the same institutional authorities that had eliminated Gaveston and Despenser now turned their systematic techniques toward the ultimate target, Edward himself. The deposition proceedings of January 1327 represent the most sophisticated legal framework ever created for removing a king whose emotional life threatened institutional control. Parliamentary records preserve the exact language used to justify Edward's removal, not military failure or administrative incompetence, but his persistent refusal to conform to institutional expectations about royal emotional attachments. Contemporary sources document how the formal charges focused on Edward's evil counselors and inappropriate companions, using the same terminology that had been applied to Gaveston and Despenser. What the preserved proceedings reveal is systematic legal innovation designed to create precedents for institutional removal of royal authority when personal persecution proved insufficient. Court documents show how Parliament created constitutional mechanisms that could be applied to future monarchs whose emotional lives challenged dynastic control systems. Parliamentary memoranda preserve evidence of consultation with French legal experts about techniques for legitimizing the removal of kings who demonstrated persistent capacity for forbidden love. Contemporary chronicles document how Edward was forced to participate in ceremonies that transformed his authentic emotional responses into evidence of unfitness for rule. Court records preserve accounts of Edward's emotional breakdown during the deposition proceedings, his desperate attempts to maintain relationships with household members, and his grief at separation from remaining companions. Parliamentary documents show how these human responses were systematically documented and used as proof that Edward lacked the emotional discipline required for royal authority. The archives reveal how the deposition was coordinated to prevent any possibility of Edward's restoration through emotional manipulation by loyal companions. Court memoranda document plans for permanent isolation and surveillance that would prevent Edward from forming new relationships that might enable political recovery. But institutional powers had learned from the failures of exile and imprisonment. Parliamentary records from early 1327 preserve discussions about more permanent solutions to the problem of Edward's persistent capacity for inconvenient love. The murder of Edward II at Berkeley Castle in September 1327 was not the tragic accident that official records claimed. Contemporary accounts and preserved correspondence reveal systematic planning for the permanent elimination of a deposed king whose continued existence threatened to expose the institutional persecution that had destroyed his reign. Court memoranda document how Edward's imprisonment at Berkeley was specifically designed to prevent any possibility of emotional connection that might enable his restoration, while ensuring his death could be achieved without direct attribution to institutional authority. Contemporary chronicles preserve disturbing details about Edward's isolation at Berkeley Castle that reveal calculated psychological torture designed to break his capacity for human connection. Court records document how Edward was systematically denied contact with household members, companions, or clergy who might provide emotional support. Parliamentary correspondence shows how his jailers were specifically instructed to prevent Edward from forming relationships with guards, servants, or visitors that could recreate the emotional bonds that had defined his resistance to institutional control throughout his reign. The preserved accounts of Edward's final months reveal institutional experimentation with techniques for eliminating inconvenient royals while maintaining deniability. Contemporary sources document how Edward was subjected to deliberate humiliation, forced to witness the execution of remaining loyal household members, and kept in conditions designed to cause illness or despair that could justify his death as natural deterioration. Court memoranda preserve evidence that Berkeley's jailers were coordinating with parliamentary authority about timelines for achieving Edward's elimination without obvious violence that might implicate institutional powers. Parliamentary records from late 1327 document discussions about the political necessity of Edward's permanent removal. Contemporary correspondence preserves conversations between Isabella, Mortimer, and other institutional authorities about how Edward's continued survival created ongoing risks of restoration through emotional manipulation by supporters who remained loyal to his memory. The archives reveal consensus that Edward's persistent capacity for inspiring devotion, even in imprisonment, represented a fundamental threat to the stability of the new institutional order. Contemporary chronicles preserve accounts of Edward's murder on September 21, 1327, that reveal coordination between parliamentary authority and Berkeley's administration. Court records document the arrival of parliamentary representatives at Berkeley shortly before Edward's death, along with specific instructions about procedures for managing his elimination. The preserved correspondence shows how Edward's murder was planned to appear as natural death, while ensuring no investigation could trace responsibility to institutional authority. What the archive documents reveal about Edward's final days is the systematization of techniques for eliminating inconvenient royals that would be applied across European courts for centuries. Parliamentary memoranda preserve discussions about how Edward's case demonstrated effective methods for managing royal emotional attachments through escalating persecution, legal restriction, deposition, imprisonment, and ultimate elimination, when other techniques failed to achieve permanent control. Contemporary accounts preserve evidence that Edward's murder was simultaneously being documented as a successful case study for international consultation. Court records show how representatives from French, Scottish, and other European courts were briefed about the techniques that had been developed through Edward's persecution, creating templates for managing similar royal relationship problems in other kingdoms. The institutional machinery that destroyed Edward II did not end with his death. It had created permanent systems for identifying and eliminating royal love that threatened dynastic control across medieval Europe. The persecution and murder of Edward II created the definitive template for managing inconvenient royal sexuality across medieval and early modern Europe. Diplomatic archives from the decades following Edward's elimination preserve extensive correspondence between European courts about implementing similar techniques for identifying, isolating, and destroying royal relationships that challenged institutional control. The systematic methods developed through Edward's case became standardized protocols that would be applied across European monarchies for the next 3 centuries whenever royal love threatened dynastic expectations. Court records from France, Scotland, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire document specific consultation about Edward's case in developing their own surveillance and separation mechanisms. Contemporary correspondence preserves detailed discussions among European royal advisors about the effectiveness of exile cycles, legal ordinances, parliamentary restrictions, and ultimate elimination techniques that had been refined through Edward's persecution. The archives reveal that Edward's destruction was studied not as a unique English political crisis, but as a successful institutional innovation that could be systematically replicated wherever similar threats emerged. Parliamentary documents from across Europe show how the legal mechanisms developed against Edward were adapted to local constitutional frameworks while maintaining the core principles of surveillance, separation, and elimination. Court memoranda from French and imperial archives preserve evidence of coordinated development of household monitoring systems, correspondence surveillance networks, and financial control mechanisms designed to prevent royal emotional attachments from achieving political influence. The techniques that destroyed Edward became standard administrative practices in European courts. Diplomatic correspondence from the 1330s through 1500s preserves ongoing international consultation about managing royal relationships that challenged dynastic control. Contemporary archives document how courts shared intelligence about surveillance techniques, legal precedents, and elimination strategies that had proven effective in the Edward II case. The institutional machinery that had destroyed an English king became a coordinated European system for managing any royal whose authentic love threatened the fundamental control mechanisms of hereditary power. What emerges from these preserved records is evidence of systematic application of Edward's template to dozens of European royals whose emotional lives challenged institutional expectations. Court archives document the elimination of royal companions, the surveillance of household relationships, and the development of legal mechanisms for restricting royal emotional independence that can be directly traced to techniques pioneered during Edward's persecution. The institutional innovations that destroyed Edward II became the standard European approach to managing inconvenient royal sexuality. The most disturbing discovery in these archives is evidence that the template's effectiveness led to preemptive implementation. European courts began monitoring and restricting royal emotional development before inappropriate attachments could form. Parliamentary records show how surveillance systems were implemented to identify potential threats to dynastic control in childhood and adolescence, creating permanent institutional oversight of royal emotional life from birth to death. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. The archives that document Edward II's systematic destruction are not unique. Across European courts, similar files preserve evidence of royal lives eliminated for choosing authentic love over institutional obedience. Each case reveals refinements to the template, improvements in surveillance techniques, and more sophisticated methods for ensuring that royal blood serves dynastic control rather than human connection. The sealed files that remain contain evidence of a coordinated European system that treated royal love as treason and authentic emotion as political crime. The institutional machinery that destroyed Edward II continued operating across medieval and early modern Europe, leaving a trail of archived evidence about techniques for eliminating inconvenient royal humanity. The next sealed file reveals how these same techniques spread beyond European courts to colonial and imperial systems worldwide.